Let's build a 2025 ready pop-up in Webflow. This approach is just going to be using their interactions platform, so no writing code. Let's get to it. First thing we're going to want is an overlay for the whole screen. To do so, let's add a div. We can use Command K to bring up search. Let's call this contact wrapper. First thing, so I can see this, let's make the background color black. And I want this full screen, so I'm going to use viewport units. So width we can set to 100% of the viewport width, or VW, and height we want to set to 100% of the viewport height. But if we use VH, it doesn't account for that toolbar at the bottom of mobile browsers, and that means that it's going to introduce scroll that we don't actually want. So let's use dynamic viewport height. If this was a real build, we'd have to make sure that this is going to be covering the whole screen no matter where the user is scrolled to. And we can do that by binding this element to the viewport itself instead of any of the elements on screen. That comes from setting the position to fixed. And that also gives us control over the z-index, which we're going to use to get this above that navbar. So let's give this a z-index of 10. Now that we've got something covering the screen, I want the user to be able to close this by clicking out of bounds. To do so, we need a dedicated element that's going to live right between this black box and the form that we're going to put on top of it. Once again, we'll add a div. I want to call this contact underlay. Because this is still a child of that black box, we can just use regular percentages, 100%, to set the size to full screen. And then in order for us to layer this correctly, we need to break this out of the normal flow of elements. We can do that by setting position to absolute. And let's reuse that same z-index, 10, that we used on the parent element. I'll cover building this form in a part 2, but here's the things it definitely needs. We want to make sure that this for sure is sitting on top of that contact underlay. So let's set the position to relative and then set your z-index higher than the 10 that we previously used. So I'm using 20. And now it's animation time. How about we actually start with closing this first? So let's select our exit button, go to interactions, and we'll use an element trigger of mouse click. And on that click, we're going to start a new animation. Let's create a timed animation. And I'm going to call this close contact. And I still always forget to select the element I'm actually trying to animate. What we want to animate is this contact wrapper. So now let's add an action. And the first thing I want is to fade this out. So let's set our opacity to 0. And then I already know that that animation, if it takes half a second, it's just going to look a little bit weird and long. So let's set that to 0.2. And for a little extra pop, let's use an easing curve. So here where it says linear, I want to set this to in-out quad. If we play this, it's going to go fast, but we see that we're getting the right effect. However, opacity is not quite enough. It just means our pop-up is invisible. They could still technically click on and fill out all of these forms without being able to see what they're writing. So let's add another action. That one's going to be hide show. And for this, we're going to select display none. That's going to take it completely off the viewport. We can save this. Now let's select that underlay element, and this will let us close the pop-up by clicking out of bounds. So again, let's go element trigger, mouse click, and we will start an animation. But don't worry, you don't have to rebuild it. Just select it right here. Let's give this a quick test. Just before we make our opening animation, let's set our default state for the contact wrapper to be display none, taking it off the screen by default. And we can scroll down and we can set our opacity to 0 by default. We want to open this pop-up using the contact button. So let's select that, go to interactions. You know the drill. I'll call this open contact. Remember to select that contact wrapper. And then we just need to reverse this versus our close animation. First, we need to go hide show. And I had mine set to display flex. Then we'll make that fade in effect using opacity, going to 100. I want to use the same 0.2 seconds of duration and with an in-out ease in. Once again, let's give this a quick test in preview. Look at you, you built it. You now have a pop-up that fades in, fades out. You can close it just by clicking out of bounds or on our exit button, and this is ready to become a component. If you want to see the full detailed builds, tune in for part 2. Otherwise, enjoy your next video.